Good morning, everyone. I am Bhavna Seduraman, a research assistant at the Peninsula Foundation. And I'm really honored to welcome you all to the conference on the Iran-Israel war, the changing security and strategic landscape of the Middle East. We have Chairman Sashi Kumar on stage, along with the founder and president of TPF, Air Marshal Mateshwaran sir, and they'll be announcing the conference and briefing about it. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to this colloquium on the Iran-Israel war, the changing security and strategic landscape of the Middle East, largely organized by the Peninsula Foundation and physically hosted, if I might call it that, here at the Asian College of Journalism. It's my task to just say a few words of welcome and especially welcome our good friend with whom we have collaborated before, Air Marshal Mateshwaran, who is the chief, as you know, of the Peninsula Foundation. When we are speaking about any topic of the region that we are concerned with today, the elephant of the room, or the elephant in the room, if you might call it that, is Gaza and the genocide going on there. I know that in think tanks there's a discussion on whether you can even call it genocide, but I choose to stay outside that academic hair splitting and call it what it is, genocide. Today's topic is not directly related to it, but I'm sure that the virtual presence of the atrocity that is going on in Gaza in terms of killings, meticulous, orchestrated, calibrated starvation of the local population, and a state which is responsible for it flaunting international law, choosing to be a loose cannon. There was a time in the 70s and 80s in India when I was a student when Israel was called the rogue state. Today I'm told it's Russia that's called that, because that's how international opinion is molded, partly by the media, which all of us are guilty of belonging to and perpetrating sometimes, partly by think tanks who are also participating in this discussion today. So this is, from my point of view, a very frank stock-taking. Unfortunately, we are in a situation where, not just in India, I think we see this happening even in the United States, where there's supposed to be great diversity of views and heterodoxy, freewheeling, where we've heard of state-led growth, but you find state-led intellectualism, booming, shall we say, except in small enclaves, academic enclaves, which are also sought to be suffocated. And you know what's happening in the US, what happened with Columbia University. Harvard continues to resist, but I don't know for how long. And therefore, we are in a situation where, the terminology itself needs to be interrogated. The proposition, the framework needs to be interrogated. And as far as our students are concerned, I'd tell you to bring to this meeting a critical awareness. We have great experts here who have in-depth knowledge of the domains that they'll be addressing. They are domain experts. At the same time, to be independent-minded in terms of understanding what is happening around there with what you're seeing physically and experiencing in the world outside. Because the idea of, shall we say, realpolitik is a term that you'll come across in the jargon of discussing geopolitics in the world today, is becoming a euphemism in many ways for some of the rank injustices which need to be normalized, normativized, or lived with. These are differences of degree. So this is my opening observation, comment, certainly from my vantage point and my perspective. There are many of you who will disagree with that and differ with that. I look forward to listening to the other point of view, to engaging with that. And let me now perform what I'm supposed to be doing here. A very, very warm welcome to everybody present here. I look forward, as each one of you, does, I believe, to the sessions that are waiting for us, to hearing the experts, to engaging with them, and I'm sure at the end of this day, there will be a substantial learning curve, particularly in terms of the would-be journalists who are the bulk of the audience today. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a great pleasure, and I thank Dr. Shashikumar for this opportunity of hosting or conducting this excellent colloquium or the conference on the Iran-Israel war and the changing security strategic landscape of the Middle East. From an Indian perspective, I would rather call it as West Asia, but we know what we mean. When I broached the topic with him, he was very kind and readily agreed to actually host this, and then we put together the experts. So you have a galaxy of experts who will touch upon various aspects, starting off with Stanley Johnny and Bashir Ahmed, and of course chaired by the just retired General Officer Commanding of the Dakshin Bharat, General Bra, kindly agreed to chair the first session. The second session will, the first session will focus on Israel and its motivations and strategic objectives, and what are the reasons for the kind of development that's taking place here, and the war itself. And this, the first session will focus on Iran, okay. And the second session will focus on Israel's motivations and strategic objectives, which will be chaired by Dr. Shashikumar, and you have the experts with Mr. Taneja, who will come online, and then we have Professor Brar from IIT Madras, and also we have the other expert from IDSA, Sam from Delhi, who will come online as well. Having looked at Iran and Israel, then we move on to the global landscape, the third session, which I will chair. And you will have Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, who's agreed to come all the way from Delhi, kind enough to join us here today. And you will have former National Security Advisor and former Governor of West Bengal, Mr. M.K. Narayanan, who will join us in the afternoon for that session. And online, you'll have the journalist and historian, Dr. Manoj Joshi as well. And that should have very engaging discussions as well. Well, as Mr. Shashikumar pointed out, what are the real reasons for the turmoil and instability that we are witnessing today? And much of all that is, you see, it's a complex process. So some will look at it from a religious angle, some will look at it from a racial and colonial perspective, and some will look at the geopolitical perspective. But as Paul Kennedy analyzed it so beautifully in his famous treatise, Rise and Fall of Great Powers, every conflict and war has a foundation on economics, economic interests, and ruthless economic interests and exploitation. So, if you really want to look at the reasons for why Israel is behaving this way, what are the problems, why have these problems come up in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq and Iran, and subsequently in many other parts of these areas, it's quite clearly it's all geopolitics. Interests of the leading powers, there are many proxies that come into play. I would say the root of these problems goes back to, and you all must be aware, in the early years of the 20th century, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and Balfour Declaration. And again, it's not about meeting certain affected people's aspiration. It's about the empire's ruthless interests, meeting those interests ruthlessly. So the French and the British Empire, who also connived with the Russian Empire at that point of time, decided to break up the Ottoman Empire and divide amongst themselves areas of influence and the areas of interest. And what were those areas of interest? Quite clearly, oil, energy was the driving factor. And therefore, this was the region that was discovered to hold the world's maximum energy reserves. And therefore, the empires divided amongst themselves, with the US still staying, Woodrow Wilson still staying out and looking at it from a overseeing perspective. They stepped in 1945, when these empires, the second set of empires, also dissolved themselves, or forced to dissolve themselves, right? And then the US comes in. So, Balfour Declaration has elements of Christian evangelism and Judaism on the face of it. Internal, underlying reasons, as Thucydides would explain the Peloponnesian War, the underlying reason is economic control. So if you really look at what happened in Iran after independence, and the famous independent prime minister was knocked off and removed by the MI6 and CIA, and a puppet, the Shah of Iran, was installed after a coup, you will understand the machinations, control of the oil industry and the energy security. And that Iran has resisted. And therefore, when in 79, Iran now liberates itself from the Western control and becomes completely independent, then Iran is always seen as a thorn in their flesh, in the interests of the West. Similarly, post-1945, while on the face of it, much of the world has decolonized, you will realize that it was only in name, sovereignty was only in name, but the colonial or the neo-colonialism and neoliberalism effectively retain economic controls on most of the processes across the world. West Africa is a classic example. Sahel is a classic example. And so also the Middle East. The Middle East was always the centerpiece. And as Cold War heightened in its intensity, the Middle East became a playing ground between the Soviet Union and the US. US interests and Soviet Union interests then gets divided between Israel as the colonial outpost of the US. Egypt and Syria becomes proxies for the Soviet Union and Iraq, and you find the French playing their legacy roles in Lebanon and in Syria as well. Syria then moves on to after the coup and after the Assads take control, moves on to the Russian camp or the Soviet camp as well. So all of this continued to actually animate the geopolitics of the region. And if you look at what happened after 79, much of the opposition to Israel in Egypt gets dissolved. That is something that's been neutralized. And the West gets Egypt in its fold for a cost of $3 billion a year that will be free funding that will be given to Egypt by the US for eternity. And therefore, you remove one opposition across, and then you have Syria to deal with, Lebanon to deal with, and then Iraq and Iran. These are the countries to be dealt with. Saudi Arabia is, thanks to Nixon's 1973 coup, Saudi Arabia and much of the Gulf countries, the oil-producing countries, fall into the trap of selling oil only for dollar. And then dollar becomes a reserve currency, and that controls them as well. So everything has an economic rooting. All that is beginning to unravel. That unraveling is also a reason for the instability. So how do we look at Israel? We recognized Israel in 1991, and we established the formal relations during Narasimha Rao's time. Since then, our relations have grown enormously. So when we look at Israel from that perspective, we tend to actually look at it from the interests of India in defense and strategic partnership. But we tend to overlook the humanitarian catastrophe that's unfolded in Gaza and elsewhere, and the apartheid regime that actually continues to wield power in Israel. For a country that wants to be a Vishwa Guru, and for a country that wants to now lead the world back again as a great power with other great powers, if your principles are not rooted in ethics and morality, then you have a problem. The decline of the West is because they've lost that rootings in the Enlightenment and ethics and morality. And therefore, a ruthless economic exploitation will always lead to serious problems in the long run. And that's what is unfolding right now. As far as the Israeli military is concerned, when I first visited in 1997, and we had a lot of projects even before that. We've been doing projects in the 80s as well, unofficially. And in the 1997, when we interacted, and officially in some of the major projects, I still have a lot of good friends in Israel, and we continue to interact. Majority of them took the view that 80% of us, or Israelis, are secularists. We don't believe in the religious Zionism or whatever it is. But they said we are controlled by that 20% of Orthodox religious leadership. And one of them very clearly made a statement: we want this conflict to end. We want this region to be shared equally between Palestinians and us. And many of them accept, as Ilan Pape said in the last colloquium very clearly, that this is a settler colony which has thrown out people and taken away their land. Many of them accept that as well. He said, and they've said, we want to live peacefully. Our children should not be in conflict. At the same time, when you go to the Wailing Wall and you look at one side, you will find young people who are entering military service being taken into one section of the construction near the Wailing Wall, which is nothing but the Jewish religious indoctrination for people entering the military. They spend about 8 months to 9 months there, and they are indoctrinated on the logic of Israel or the Jewish basis of Israel. And that has a problem, because that would vitiate a military's culture, and that is showing up today. And it is much like what Zia al-Haq did to the Pakistani army as well. It's about the same thing. So many of us in the Indian military, we have very high opinions on the basis of what Israel did to survive in 48, in 67, and 73. These were military leaders who led the Israeli military, IDF, on the strength of their experiences of having fought the Second World War and having imbibed a certain military culture. So you had Moshe Dayan, you had many other leaders. Of course, you also had certain mavericks like Ariel Sharon, who won't fit in that bill as well. But a good friend of ours, General Yossi Ben Hanan, who's now bedridden, unable to talk because of the poor health, was a hero of the 73 war, who was wounded 3 times in the space of 12 days and was saved by one Netanyahu, the brother of today's Prime Minister. So these are people who've agreed, and when we did a project, we had military pilots who would also be working with us, who would say the Syrians and Egyptians were excellent fighters. The Palestinians are equally good fighters. So when the Secretary General of UN says after October 7th, it didn't happen in vacuum, you need to understand the full history and go back to the origins of the problem. Similarly, when I visited Cairo's Defense Museum, and when you now read about the 73 war, you will realize that much of what you read about Israeli exploits of the IDF needs to be taken down with a lot of salt. And you need to correlate. The 73 war was primarily done and waged with the objective of restoring or recovering Egyptian pride and proving themselves. Did they achieve that? they did achieve that. When you read a lot of exhibits and you see a lot of research material in that very nice museum in Cairo, then you will probably understand the balance between the two. So I think when you now look at what's happening today, Iran then, while the West paints Iran as a ruthlessly fundamentalist Islamic regime, I think we know far better than anybody else in the world of the historical and civilizational legacies of Iran, and that plays a major role. Religion is only one part of it. But I think you need to look at what Iran is as a civilizational state and how it will stand against threats, and that is proved very clearly in what happened in the 12-day war. So when you want to analyze this entire war and move ahead, I think you need to dig into a bit of history, dig into the geopolitical reasons, dig into the economic reasons that drive some of these behaviors, and then come to an understanding as to where Israel stands, where Iran stands in the changing geopolitical dynamics of today's world. And today's world, the changing geopolitical dynamics rests on the fact that the world order is changing. The dominance of the West of the last 400 years is declining, and a new world order is emerging. It may take another 2 decades. But in this emergence of a new world order, Israel will get impacted severely. Iran will play a major role, and Central Asia will be extremely important. Much like what Halford McInnes said, it probably will be a geopolitical pivot or a pivot of history as well. Thank you very much. I wish you all a very good conference, and I look forward to very engaging sessions for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sashikumar and Air Marshal Mateshwan, sir. Without further ado, we'll start with the first session, which focuses on Iran. This session will explore Iran's core strategic objectives and the extent to which it was successful in achieving them, a damage assessment of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, the position of the proxy network, Ayatollah and the future of the regime, and the effect of this confrontation on Iran's domestic and international relations. Chairing this session, we have General Karan Singh Brar. He has had an inviolable career spanning close to 4 decades across various operational areas and sectors to include the Northeast, Jammu and Kashmir, deserts and plains. His command appointments include command of a brigade in Jammu and Kashmir in counterinsurgency operations, a sector in the UN mission in South Sudan, and an infantry division in the Western sector. Thank you, Karan Singh Brar, sir. We also have our first speaker for the session, Dr. Stanley Johnny. He is the International Affairs Editor with The Hindu. He has a PhD in International Studies from the Center for West Asian Studies, JNU, New Delhi, and he has been writing on geopolitics and Indian foreign policy for over a decade, has reported from different parts of the world, from Washington to Moscow and Jerusalem to Tehran. He is a visiting professor at Kriya University, Sri City, Andhra Pradesh, an adjunct faculty member at Asian College of Journalism, and a visiting fellow at Kerala University, Thiruvananthapuram. He is the author of The ISIS Caliphate, From Syria to the Doorsteps of India, and Original Sin, Israel, Palestine, and the Revenge of Old West Asia, and co-author of The Comrades and the Mullahs, China, Afghanistan, and the New Asian Geopolitics. Our second speaker for this session is Bashir Ali Abbas. He is a senior research associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, New Delhi, and member of the facilitating team for the Chow Track, the longest-running Track 2 dialogue between India and Pakistan. His research focuses on strategic and political issues in South Asia and the Middle East, and he has formerly been a fellow at the Stimson Center, Washington, D.C., and the Takshashila Institution, Bangalore. A weekly contributor to the Indian Express and former columnist for Hindustan Times, he has worked extensively on security affairs, naval strategy, and international law. I kindly request the speakers in the chair to join me on stage.
Jai Hind and good morning. Firstly, I'd like to thank Asian College of Journalism and the Peninsula Foundation for inviting me to this colloquium on the Iran-Israel war, changing security and strategic landscape of the Middle East, and also for the opportunity of chairing this first session on Iran. I have with me two eminent speakers who have already been introduced. Mr. Stanley John, Foreign Affairs Editor, The Hindu, and Mr. Bashir Ali Abbas, who's researcher with all his qualification on nuclear security and Middle East politics. So to start the session, this war, which was a 12-day war, has implication, of course, for the countries which are involved in the Middle East, but it has also a lot of implications for India, directly and indirectly. And it has other consequences to the power struggle which you see now happening all across the world powers, whether it's US, Russia, or indirectly even China. So there's a kind of a great game which is on, and I will fully agree with Air Marshal Matheswaran that the national interests, so the interests take priority. They may get camouflaged in ideology, religion, and all other things, but ultimately it is the power and the money which is dictating things. So in that regard, whatever you see, I may suggest to you, please see where are our national interests. Because if we don't take care of our national interests, nobody else obviously will. So whatever we see or do, we should see that we are not harmed in any way, whether by division or whether by something else. So anyway, to come to this 12-day war, as you would all know, that this was the direct confrontation between Iran and Israel, possibly for the first time, or of this scale. Otherwise, it was always a proxy war. India also talks of a proxy war which is on by our Western neighbor, but this was a proxy engagement by which the Israel and it was fighting the other elements. And as the background which you all know, that in 1979, the Khomeini regime, when it took over, of course, it didn't recognize Israel. And therefore, the power it decided to build the axis of resistance, which was around Israel. One was, of course, Hamas, then Hezbollah in Lebanon, then the Houthis in Yemen, and of course, the Assad regime in Syria. So, something which is happening in Syria also has implication for this war. And what is happening in Syria, you have Russia and US fighting. So, everywhere there are these interests. And I can tell you again, just to reiterate, I have been in 2-3 UN missions. All UN missions are dictated by world powers for resources in Africa. Most of the fighting in Africa will stop if the world powers move out from there. They are making people fight, all because Congo, I was there, it has the largest number of resources. I was in South Sudan, the most bloodiest of UN missions. So again, it is that story which is going on. So coming back to this war of this 12-day conflict or confrontation. So this thing between Iran and Israel has been going on, and of course that will be discussed. I will not delve into that. But why the thing happened now? I think possibly two reasons. Whether it was triggered or whether it was actual, maybe the speakers can highlight, and maybe some of you will also know that. One was that there was an allegation that they have started enriching the uranium. Almost 60% of it was enriched within last 5 months of 2025. So this heightened enrichment of uranium, so that they were in a place to make a nuclear weapon, possibly as cited, was one reason. But there was an indirect two other reasons which I think were because this, after the 7th October attack, which we all know, Israel has been going after these, whether it was Hezbollah, they eliminated Nasrallah and all the other leaders, and so also this thing, and whatever has been happening in Gaza, that's on the other side, humanitarian side. I'm just talking from the military point of view. So Israel went all out, and they had reasonably weakened this axis of resistance. And the Syria regime fell in December 2024. So Syria was gone, Hezbollah was down, Hamas was down. So maybe Israel thought this is the best time to strike Iran directly, because there was a tacit agreement between Iran and this axis that if Iran attacks, you will go full out. But as you have seen, when the attack happened, none of the Hezbollah, Hamas, they didn't react. The only reaction came from Houthis, who fired some few missiles, which supposedly was some kind of a hypersonic missile made by Iran. And they did strike. So this 12-day war continued, and of course, initially, of course, Israel, they are known for their intelligence. They were inside Iran, where they carried out, again I'm talking the military, that way they are good. They have intelligence, they have AI, they have technology, which India has to learn. So they were inside Iran, and they struck their generals. They eliminated most of their generals and the people who were actually building up the axis of resistance. So that is what happened, and the war continued. And of course, then Iran did strike back, and there was obviously damage to Israel also. But then in the info war, you never knew who won. If you took at the press from the Middle East, they said Iran had resisted US and that attack and this. But anyway, I think everybody wanted an off-ramp. Our Nobel Prize candidate, he came in with his B-2 bombers, and he said we have destroyed the nuclear sites, whereas they said it was a little damage. So they went to Qatar. So all that, I think, is known part of the headlines. So it was kind of a ceasefire was declared. But I must tell you, when we were in academy, that is talking in 80s, we had, there was the Iran-Iraq war, if you are aware, 1980 to 88. It was a very long war. We had officers from Iran and Iraq both training with us. So when officers train, and at that young age, you get to know a lot of things. So some of the things which I said are followed of that. But in that war, Russia was supporting Iraq. US was neutral, but they supported Iraq. But after 4 years, US, which was supporting Iraq, they struck Iraq against Saddam Hussein. And now, it's all a question of national interest. So US and the powers who decide what happens in the world, they go after their national interest. So if we interpret too much of what is going to happen, you just see what they want, and you will get to have a very clear answer. So the same thing is happening to Pakistan. Now, a nuclear bomb with Iran is not allowed, but here the president of Pakistan is announcing that he will blow up the half world from US is not a threat. You have all the terrorists of the world in Pakistan, they are not a threat, but Iran is a threat. So, how you shape, and you are the people who are the journalist lot, how you shape the opinion. Actually, shaping opinion is now more important than actually winning the war. Like in Op Sindoor, we know we did everything, but it is the shaping the narrative which makes a difference. You are more than a weapon, the journalist. So I will not speak too much. So I'll request Mr. Stanley to cover, after all this, where is Iran? What happens to his axis of resistance? Will it accede to US pressure? And everything which, with your experience.
Morning, everyone. General Brar, Bashir, who is a good friend. And thanks to SEJ and Peninsula Foundation for organizing this conference. Shashikumar sir, Marshal Matisharan. I would also glad to meet Ambassador Mukhopadhyaya after our last meeting in Delhi. And my former boss is here, Mukund Patmanabhan. I'm glad to see him here as well. On June 23rd, I was in Doha. The war was going on, the aerial battle was going on, and in the evening, the airspace was shut. So we were just talking to each other that something is going to happen. Because I was sure that the Iranians were going to do something, or it could be a token measure, but definitely they were going to do something, because the Iranians always retaliate. When General Qasem Soleimani was killed, the Iranians attacked an American air base in Iraq, right? When their embassy was attacked in Damascus, they retaliated with hundreds of missiles. When Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran, the Iranians launched some 300 ballistic missiles towards Israel. So interestingly, Iran is the only country in West Asia that attacked both Israeli and American bases in West Asia. So when the Iranian nuclear bases were attacked, it was evident that they were going to respond, but how they were going to respond was a question. Then the airspace was shut. So I thought that they would attack either the Al Udeid air base in Qatar or the American naval facilities in Bahrain. And then we were at this place called, what Malayalis in Doha called Wal Signal. So Wal is the sword, right? So at one interjunction, you could see these two big swords crossing against each other. And everybody, the Malayalis in Doha started calling it Wal Signal. Now apparently everybody in Doha, including non-Indians, are calling it Wal Signal. So we were at the Wal Signal. I was with a friend. Then I could see the missiles coming. So I told him that the Iranians are now attacking Al Udeid air base. Then we could also see that the missiles being intercepted by either Qatari or American interceptors in the sky with loud noises. And it took 2 hours for Trump's first response. And then he said that, of course, we could also hear, some impact noise was also there, audible. And then Trump tweeted that they launched some 15 missiles and 14 of them were shot down. Only 1 were allowed to hit because it was not a threat to the American base. And he also announced a ceasefire between the Israelis and the Iranians. And Trump made it clear that he was not going to retaliate, right? And then he gave some 6 hours for the ceasefire to kick in. And in those 6 hours, both the Israelis and the Iranians were again attacking against each other. The Israelis carried out 1 wave of attack. And with minutes left for the ceasefire to kick in, the Iranians launched some 50 ballistic missiles that hit Beersheba, killing some 5 people. And the Israeli airplanes took off again. And that's when Trump went to Twitter again on Truth Social. He said, first in a press conference in the White House, he said the Israelis and the Iranians don't know what the F they are doing. And then on Truth Social, he said, Israel, turn back your planes. This was more of a command than a request. And then he again tweeted saying that the Israeli planes are returning after a friendly plane wave. The planes carried out a symbolic attack, but eventually they listened to what Trump demanded. Trump asked them to do. They didn't carry out any massive attack in Iran. So the ceasefire came into force, right, after the so-called 12-day war. Now, how did the war begin? See, the Israelis always wanted to test the military solution, the military option. We know that in 2015 you had the JCPOA, negotiated by the Obama administration. Hassan Rouhani was the president of Iran, and the Germans, the French, the British, the Russians, and the Chinese, the European Union as an entity, they all were involved. And JCPOA envisaged a plan that would set back the Iranian nuclear program by 10 years in return for lifting of the sanctions. And it was Donald Trump who unilaterally sabotaged JCPOA in 2018 by withdrawing the United States from the agreement when Iran was still fully compliant with the terms of the agreement according to IAEA, 2018 May, right? And the Israelis were always opposed to JCPOA. I remember talking to an Israeli diplomat who told us that no deal is better than a bad deal. She called it a bad deal. They didn't want a diplomatic agreement because they thought the problem, from an Israeli point of view, was not only the nuclear program, but also letting Iran join the diplomatic and economic mainstream of West Asia, because that would allow Iran substantially raise its conventional power, which was also seen as a threat by the Israelis. So they were not very hot about JCPOA. So they were pretty happy when Trump destroyed JCPOA. But the destruction of the JCPOA also set the path towards an eventual conflict, right? So Netanyahu always wanted to test the military solution. He had two obstacles. One, Iran was relatively powerful in the region because of the so-called axis of resistance. So they had Hezbollah from the 1980s, and then other groups in the region, right? You have Hashad al-Shabi in Iraq and Syria, and Houthis, they came into the force much later, but still they are a powerful presence. And then you have Hamas and Islamic Jihad and all these groups. So that's one thing. And the Russians were there in Syria from 2015 onwards. The Syrian regime had turned around the civil war. We know that. I mean, I'm talking about the pre-Assad fall period. So relatively powerful in the region. And second, the United States always, they didn't come around when it comes to a military solution. So because the Israelis wanted that green light from the United States, they can't attack Iran alone. Iran is a much bigger country. Israel, all said and done, is dependent on the United States. They need that support from the United States. So two things happened after October 7. So if you look at October 7, Israel's response was two-folded, right? One is the war on Gaza, which is still going on, and the other was the regional angle. So Israel fought the two-faced war. One is the complete destruction of Gaza. Gaza is turning into dust now as we speak. And on the other side, the war went to an open confrontation with Hezbollah, where Hezbollah was set back, Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated, and that pager explosions substantially weakened Hezbollah's interconnectivity, etc., etc. And Israel also started a 1-month-long operation in Lebanon, basically setting back Hezbollah. That's one thing. And Hamas was forced to reinvent itself as an insurgency, not as an organized militant outfit in Gaza, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Okay, so we can argue that the axis of resistance was weakened. That also deteriorated Iran's regional influence in West Asia. And the major, the lethal blow came when the Assad regime fell in Syria in early December 2024. So interestingly, it took only 12-13 days for Jolani, who's now called Ahmad al-Shara. So Jolani, just 12 days to reach Damascus from Idlib. And the advance from Idlib, so they were controlling HTS, is the organization. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. HTS used to be Al-Qaeda. Okay, this is fact. The previous name of HTS was Jabhat al-Nusra, and Jabhat al-Nusra was the official Al-Qaeda arm in Syria. And Jolani is the guy who was designated to run Al-Qaeda in Syria by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Everybody knows Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but nobody wants to remember this fact. So the war with Hezbollah came to an end on November 27th. And on November 28th, HTS starts its offensive. And 12-13 days, they reach Damascus, and the Syrian government collapses. So from Israeli point of view, the axis of resistance has been set back, and the government in Syria falls, which substantially rolls back Iran's regional influence. So the next question is how the Americans will come around. So Donald Trump comes to power in January 2025. So Trump initiates talks with Iran, of course, and the talks were going on. In fact, when the Israelis launched the war on June 13th, the Americans and the Iranians were scheduled to meet for their 6th round of talks on June 15th in Muscat. The Israelis still went ahead. But I assume that Trump was always on board. Netanyahu got his green light from Trump because the Israelis alone, they knew that they wouldn't be able to destroy Iranian nuclear facilities because of the three, especially Fordo is buried deep underground. Israel doesn't have the capacity or capability to destroy a nuclear facilities. Not even the Americans could. That's the story. The Israelis knew that they wanted Americans. So Trump, I think, was on board. So they got the green light from the Americans. So they go in, right? So they wanted to test the nuclear, they want to test the military solution. So quickly, what the Israelis wanted to do, they wanted to, of course, destroy the nuclear capacities, right? Iran's nuclear capacity, Iran's nuclear program. And then secondly, what Israel wanted to do, again, the operation had two sides. One was direct attack on the nuclear facilities, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. And the second was this, what they call, Red Wedding, Operation Red Wedding. I know you have seen Game of Thrones. So they wanted to basically take down the entire chain of command. The Israeli generals called it Operation Red Wedding. Entire chain of command, so that they thought they would cripple the Iranian military. This is what they did on June 6th, 1967, when they bombed the Egyptian Air Force. They completely destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force in a single day in 1967. And that incapacitated Egypt. So they wanted to do the same thing. On the one side, you attack the nuclear facilities. On the other side, you cripple Iranian military response. And then you weaken, you deteriorate the state, the Iranian state. This is what they wanted to do. And from a military point of view, this was a daunting operation. And they managed to kill, as General Brar pointed out, they killed the IRGC chief, they killed the Iranian military chief, they killed the Air Force chief, they killed some 30 security chiefs in a single day operation in Iran. And that was something, that was a remarkable operation from an operational point of view. But it's also interesting that Iran recovered at a remarkable pace, the Iranian state. On the second day, they started retaliating. They started firing dozens of ballistic missiles every day. And this ballistic missile attack continued 12 days consecutively. And Iran and Israel was trying to defend it with their famed Arrow Iron Dome, all these missile defense systems, but also supported by the Jordanians, the French, the British, and the Americans. So Israel is one of the most fortified countries in terms of the missile defense, right? Everybody was defending Israel. But still, Iran managed to hit some 5 missile facilities, 5 military facilities in Israel, and the Haifa oil refinery, and a research institute in Tel Aviv, several apartment complexes, a hospital in Beersheba. Some 13,000 people were displaced. Some 24 people, according to official accounts, were killed. So despite Israel's claim of taking down most of Iranian missile launchers and missile facilities, Iran continued to retaliate, right? So that's one thing. And then secondly, Reuters reported that Iran was already planning to mine the Strait of Hormuz, and if the Iranians did that, that would have been catastrophic for global economy. So if the Israelis expected that this would cripple the Iranian military response, that didn't happen. And the Americans had to join in, of course, to attack the nuclear facilities on 21st of June. So the Iranians continued to respond, that's one thing. And then secondly, they were planning to mine the Strait of Hormuz. And third, if the Israelis expected this to lead some kind of movement or some kind of revolutionary uprising in Iran, they were mistaken. That didn't happen. On the contrary, the regime, at least from a political point of view, the Iranian state consolidated. From an operational point of view, from an administrative point of view, from a political point of view, what you saw that during the 12 days, the regime was consolidating faster than many people expected. So then it was evident that the war cannot continue, because Israel, continued to take hit from the Iranians. And Trump also, yes, he joined the war, he attacked the nuclear facilities, but also he also didn't want to get involved in a protracted war in West Asia, another protracted war. And you can see Trump's own base was revolting even after the United States joined the war. Trump's own base, the conservative talk show hosts, including US Congress people, Marjorie Greene Taylor, who was a very close supporter of Trump, she herself came out and attacking the war. So Trump was also under immense pressure in the United States. He didn't want to get involved in another prolonged war. He just wanted to do one hit and take back and move back. That's what he did. So it was evident that a ceasefire was necessary, So that's how the war came to an end. Now, one quick last point is that whether the war achieved its objectives. So as I said, the Israelis wanted to destroy the nuclear facilities, and Netanyahu said to Fox News when the war was on that regime change could be one of the outcomes of the operation. So that didn't happen. And did they destroy the nuclear facilities? Trump says that the American attack has completely obliterated the Iranian nuclear facilities. but the American intelligence assessment is that at best the American attacks have set back the Iranian nuclear program by a few months. Just keep this in mind. JCPOA, which Donald Trump and the Israelis opposed, had at least set back the nuclear program by 10 years. JCPOA was signed in 2015. Now we are in 2025. And the military option you are talking about, according to American own intelligence estimates, set back the Iranian nuclear program by a few months. That's one thing. Rafael Grossi, IAEA chief, says Iran will start spinning its nuclear program within a few months. Again, I mean, they will be able to do that. And Iran had some 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. Okay? So if you and I knew that the Israelis were going to attack them, the Iranians definitely knew that they were going to try this option. So, I mean, if you use your common sense, they were not going to keep this 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium in these 3 obvious locations, right? And there are European intelligence estimates that suggested that the Iranians had moved out their highly enriched uranium and dispersed across the country, and it's a huge country. It's a huge country. So there is no evidence whether the highly enriched uranium was destroyed. There is no evidence to suggest that the nuclear plants themselves were destroyed. Forget about nuclear capability. I mean, even if you destroy the nuclear facilities, you still have the nuclear capabilities, which you have achieved over the years. You killed 30 scientists, but you have hundreds of other scientists. It's a huge country, right? So did you achieve your objectives? No. Did the regime fall? No, it didn't happen. So the third point is that this is now, I mean, if Iran was willing to engage from a diplomatic point of view, now I think there is a growing consensus in Iran that if Iran had the nuclear bomb, the Israelis wouldn't have attacked them. See, everybody hates North Korea, right? The Americans do not like them. Nobody likes them. But nobody goes and bombs North Korea. Why? The difference is, I mean, I may not like the North Koreans, but I mean, Kim Jong-un could be a crazy guy. But the difference between the North Koreans and the Iranians, the difference between the North Koreans and the Iraqis, the difference between the North Koreans and the Libyans is that the North Koreans have the bomb. The Iraqis didn't have the bomb. The Libyans didn't have the bomb. The Iranians don't have the bomb. So, I mean, if anything, what happened on the 12-day war is an additional encouragement for the Iranian leaders to pursue the path of the bomb. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we'll have some time for questions, and many questions will be given to you. The point which you made, like US was asked, why did you bomb Iraq? Or they said they have the bomb. But they bomb Iran because they have the bomb, and some other place they have the bomb. Well, why don't you bomb North Korea? They actually have the bomb. So anyway, so I think your last point is a leading question to Mr. Bashir. Have the nuclear facilities been destroyed? Has the points which given to him that they are in a position to again restart? Now, apart from this fissile material which was getting enriched, there are many scientists which have been killed. So, you know, that is another important aspect. And which country is going to help them? Is it Pakistan won't be allowed to? Is it North Korea? Is it somebody? Because after all, you know, you do need support. So that is the nuclear part, and since you are an expert in that. And the second part, this regime change. Has the Khomeini regime or the current regime been weakened? Is there a likelihood of regime change, or is Iran back to its earlier thing, or you find again some, you know, something being done by US internally, which we are not aware? So these are the two main points, and other things which you can then continue from where he has left. Thank you.
So firstly, in immense gratitude to both the Peninsula Foundation and the Asian College of Journalism. It's incredibly hard to follow Dr. Stanley, but what I'll try and do is stand on the shoulder of a giant and speak to everybody after the second row at least, because, and if I say anything wrong, I'm sure the institutional memory that the first row represents will catch my words. That having been said, very, very grateful for the lucid remarks that Dr. Stanley just made, but if I may, among the two questions that have been addressed to me, I wish to take the second one first, which is Iran's internal turmoil and how that factors in its decision making vis-a-vis both Israel, the region at large, as well as the United States. I would argue that since October 2023 until now, the Iranians did not fight a single conflict on their own terms. The conflict almost invariably was imposed on them. What Iran has consistently shown is a credible ability to respond, retaliate, and preserve a certain sense of deterrence that it defines, right? In terms of how Iran treated the Iran-Israel war, in fact, this is something that I was discussing with Dr. Stanley earlier as well, that on June 11th, I don't know how many of you remember, but there was a Bloomberg report that said that the Israelis are preparing to attack Iran. And I remember asking a few Iranian diplomats what they think as to when this attack might come. And the Muscat round of talks was to happen just 2 days later. And they said, we know the Israelis will attack, but they won't do it before the Muscat round because the Iranians had enough faith in the Americans to prevail over the Israelis. I found it a little amusing because perhaps the concentration of people who do not trust the Americans the most is in Tehran. And yet here, the Iranian diplomats were telling me that they believe that the Israeli attack will potentially be delayed. But nonetheless, June 12th, we know what happened, and we know what happened in the 12 days thereafter. That having been said, let me come back to the original point when I say that Iran did not fight these conflicts on its own terms. Let's wind the clock back a little because of the number of things that happen, we lose track of even recent history, forget distant memories. When Ibrahim Raisi was still the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, a large part of the mandate given to him was to take control of the economy and to fix it because the Iranian economy since 2018 has hovered, I think, with around 30% inflation, and that has only gone higher and higher. Raisi, while pitched to be several things, including a potential successor to the supreme leader, was not a man who did an impressive job with the economy. And this is something that you saw manifest in even the supreme leader's own assertions that there was a lot of disappointment. You combine that with the degree of social unrest in Iran, which we ultimately saw as the Mahsa Amini protests, which ultimately then snowballed into a protest against Khamenei himself, as many protests in Iran have done for almost decades now. It was very clear that things were not okay, but what became clear by even March 2024, when Khamenei gave his Nowruz speech, is the large focus on the Iranian economy, where Khamenei seemed to suggest that Iran cannot fix this without taking measures at a global level, which means sanctions relief, right? So even when the war started on the 7th of October, and as Iran itself was eventually dragged into these dyads with Israel first in April, then in October, and then June this year, I would argue that that economic logic somehow even remained. In March 2024, Khamenei also sort of makes these assertions that whatever the Iranian government was doing was not enough, because you could see that the Iranian rial, I think, had depreciated by about 60% compared to the US dollar. And the purchasing power of the middle class especially, who are the most affected by the sanctions, was very visible on the street, right? However, because of what happened on October 7th and Israel's ensuing war on Gaza, I'd say the Iranians were forced into a bit of an ideological commitment trap, right? You would have to preserve the position that you have maintained for decades, and yet you cannot lose track of the fact that you have a burgeoning domestic threat to the regime. I use the word threat for the lack of a better term. I do not mean that the regime was, on the brink of collapse, as many people like to think. But that having been said, what is my evidence for this? That the Iranians today pay more attention to economic factors than arguably in the past. That since 1979, the Ayatollahs of Iran have warned the Iranian people of one thing in particular, among many other things, and that is a direct attack on the Iranian homeland by the great Satan, which is the United States, and the little Satan, which is Israel, right? So one would expect that when this attack finally happened, the conservatives and the hardliners in Iran would prevail over the liberals, the reformists, the progressives, whatever we wish to label them as, and that all talk of Iran engaging the United States would be completely off the table, right? The opposite happened. right? As the Israeli attacks started and continued, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think Arakchi kept saying that the Iranians are willing to come back to the table if Israel stops. If that alone is not an indicator of where Iran's priorities lie today, I don't know what else is, right? And this is important because in the days leading up to the war with Israel, Iranian leaders, including those who hold a large quantum of influence in the Supreme Leader's office, were openly talking about quoting American investment in Iran, right? And we have some precedent for this. If you remember when the JCPOA was signed, one of the first things that the Iranians did was to look towards Boeing, was to look towards American companies, because they know that they need to reintegrate with the international financial system and undo the crippling effect that both American and European sanctions in the past have had on the Iranian economy, and now with the United States' maximum pressure campaign, right? So here, even Ali Shamkhani, who again is very close to the Iranian Supreme Leader's office, was making, was sending largely positive signals about the progress of negotiations between Iran and Israel, right? The Israeli attack happens in the middle of these negotiations. But I'll wrap this point up by pointing out to you a distinction between how the Iranian regime reacted to Israel attacks and how the Iranian people did, right? As Dr. Stanley also pointed out, one of Netanyahu's ambiguously stated aims was regime change in Iran, right? What did the Iranian regime do? And since you also brought up the Iran-Iraq war, when the Iran-Iraq war was being fought, the Iranian the revolutionary regime was a nascent regime, right? They framed the need to defend the Iranian homeland against Saddam's armies as a sacred defense. The foundations of the logic that the new Iranian government sold to their people was extremely theological. Now, when Israel attacks, it is pretty different. Now, you immediately after the war began, you could see murals and paintings appear in cities like Tehran and Shiraz that pay homage to pre-Islamic figures from the Achaemenid Empire, right? Figures like Arash the Archer, people comparing Khamenei to Achaemenid kings. Khamenei, who himself had once called the Achaemenids, talking of the Achaemenids as something delusional, right? That changed, right? And the Iranians knew that today, nationalism in Iran, well, in any country, wartime nationalism is a very strong binding agent, even if it's a temporary one. We saw it ourselves post the Pahalgam terror attacks. But in Iran, nationalism is a complex subject. Nationalism doesn't simply mean loyalty to the Islamic government, but for them, nationalism can also mean nationalism to the Iranian state and the Iranian identity, rather than the more universal globalist Islamic identity that this revolutionary regime brought in 1979. What we saw this time is the Iranian regime tap into those sentiments, right? That was the regime. The people, on the other hand, reciprocated. You could see them almost meet midway, and it was a very uncomfortable meeting. You had prominent Iranian dissidents and activists, both based in Iran, mostly outside Iran, and mostly in the United States, say that the Iranian dissidents and activists very much want an end to the regime, but on their own terms. The Iranian people have a very long sense of history. They remember every domino that fell since the fall of Mossadegh, all the way up till the Israeli attacks, right? And if you remember the videos of Israeli missiles hitting urban centers in Tehran, the Israelis weren't buying any great stock amongst the Iranian people, and the Iranian people also made it very clear. It is also clear that Benjamin Netanyahu's goals were always absolutist. I would argue that the IDF knew very well that the goal of regime change in Iran is not even the stars, it's in a different galaxy, because empowering or inducing empowerment amongst Iranian activists alone will not bring about regime change unless you see substantial constituencies within Iran rebel and take charge, which almost arguably has to include sections of the IRGC as well. But again, that's a different debate. The point here is that the Iranians adapted, the Iranian regime adapted. How will they deal with such conflicts in the future? It's a gamble. But just to point out to you as to what the regime itself thinks, I'd want to read out something that Ali Akbar Velayati said. And he's again a man who has very close links to the Supreme Leader's office. He says that national cohesion, as emphasized by the Supreme Leader, may now require changes in the state's social approach and prioritizing the people's satisfaction in tangible ways. The people have proven themselves. It is now the authorities' turn. Expired methods will no longer meet the needs of post-war society. What does the Iranian government do on July 30? It withdraws a bill quietly that would have imposed harsher punishments on Iranians for criticizing the government on the internet. The Supreme National Security Council of Iran, which is a very conservative body, prevents harsher punishments for the hijab bill, which of course had spurred the initial protests on the streets in favor of Mahsa Amini, right? So you can see a certain degree of adaptation. Does this mean that there is now a new social contract between the Iranian regime and the Iranian people? I absolutely do not think so. If anything, I think this is a pound of flesh that the Iranian people have extracted from the regime, because there is one thing that this Iranian generation has not seen, and I've said this elsewhere, and that is a succession of the Supreme Leader's office. There has been only one succession in the past. This generation is not bound by those fraternal ties that are created during wartime, as it was during the Iran-Iraq war, or as it was during the Iranian Revolution, as the senior leadership of the Iranian regime is still bound by those ties, but the new generation is not, right? And well, Khamenei is growing old. I do not believe in any conspiracy that he's on the brink of death and he might, we might lose him in the next week. But whenever it happens, the Iranian regime knows that it will happen sooner than later. And that succession is going to be a sensitive moment within Iranian society, regardless of what any country outside Iran does, right? And I'll leave that point there. And now I'll move to the nuclear issue, right? A lot of the facts, I'm very grateful for it, was already covered by Dr. Stanley. But very quickly, what was the assessment after the United States especially conducted its B-2 bombardment on sites especially in Fordo and Natanz, and to a more limited extent in Isfahan? There are three things that became very clear in the assessment of both US intelligence community and as well as external observers. Is if you wish to conduct an assessment of such things, if I want to look at proof of Iran having taken damage, I want to hear the Iranians say it. If I want to see proof of the Americans admitting they couldn't fully obliterate Iran's nuclear stockpiles, I want to hear the Americans say it. And both of them did. Arakchi recently admitted that the Iranians took significant damage, but their capabilities and their knowledge remains. But that's a secondary point. On the Americans' part, J.D. Vance in a television interview says that they still need to engage the Iranians on the question of what to do about their existing stock of 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. If Trump, who said that that stockpile was obliterated, then something like this would certainly not have been said, but I think that's a rather obvious point. Coming back to the three things. The first is that Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities have certainly been damaged, especially the overground facilities in Natanz, and I think limited damage at the Fordo underground facilities, as well as the Isfahan Nuclear Technical Research Center, right? But certain sites were also not targeted, and this is a site south of Natanz, which the Iranians call, I think, Pickaxe Mountain or Pickaxe Hill, which several people believe housed parts of the 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, as well as a site northeast of Isfahan, where at least I think Rafael Grossi, the IAEA director, believes that Iran was constructing a third nuclear enrichment site, right? That ambiguity remains, as does ambiguity surrounding where the 400 kg of 60% uranium is. And the third is that Iran's nuclear know-how exists, right? It continues to exist, and that is not something you can take away, even though you can severely weaken their immediate capabilities by eliminating a lot of their senior scientists, right? Objectively, as Dr. Stanley also pointed out, it's very clear to us that the value of the nuclear deterrent has been proved. And if I had to add a country there, I would add Ukraine, right? Objectively, that is the case. But if I may say so, understanding, if I were to simply assess the trajectory of Iran's nuclear thought, the information is out there. What I want to try and do is provide a lens to it. The lens through which I see it is that the Iranians have gone through three major turns in their history, the Islamic regime, I mean, in terms of how it views nuclear weapons. The first turn was the Iran-Iraq war, when it became credibly evident that Iraq had used weapons of mass destruction, especially chemical weapons, against Iranian troops. The Iranians, again, a nascent regime, knew that this is a potent instrument of causing pain, and the Iranians' first reaction, arguably, despite internal debates, was to proceed towards Project Ahmad, with the help of networks such as those of AQ Khan, and show limited enrichment capability, right? And that continued, I think, across the 1990s and eventually also drew the fury of the international community. But that was the first turn for the Iranians, and I would say the locus of their motivations lay in the 8-year-long protracted Iran-Iraq war. The second turn comes by 2003, when you have the US invasion of Iraq on the pretext of, well, exactly this, that Iraq has WMDs and, well, the Iranian regime needs to be removed. As a revolutionary government that has also been named as part of the axis of evil by the likes of George Bush and Colin Powell, I would say that that was the second turn for the Iranians, because that's when the Iranians start publicizing, I think, a pre-existing fatwa by Ayatollah Khamenei that calls nuclear weapons as haram or prohibited. And what is the logic that they give for it? The Iran-Iraq war, saying that if you have weapons that are so heinous and barbaric, then surely they can't be Islamic, right? So you see a subversion of the same source of motivation. And if you go to Khamenei's website today, you will see that it was posted in October 2023. The Iranians, of course, reiterate this in front of the IAEA. Obama quotes the fatwa himself in 2010, in 2011. And I think a degree of ambiguity continues, because that's when the Iranians really construct Fordo. And you have an Iranian nuclear dissident group that reveals its existence. But the third decisive turn is what happened in June, right? As I said, that the war that the Iranians have always feared, for the lack of a better term, happened. But now what? There is one peculiar factor here that makes it difficult to assess how exactly the Iranians will proceed, which is that the war with Israel and the United States, and sir, I'll just take 2 more minutes. The war with Israel and the United States did not occur in a vacuum, in the absence of negotiations, in a predicament where the conservatives and the hardliners were dominating Iranian society. No, it was in the opposite situation. You had a reformist president, you had only positive signals from both Tehran as well as Washington. You almost even caught a glimpse of Steve Witkoff and, well, Abbas Araghchi shaking hands, right? So it happened at the height of diplomacy, not in the absence of it. And yet the war happened. So what lessons do the Iranians take away from this? I frankly do not know. But my inference is that the question that we focus on Iran's nuclear thought and whether Iran will seek nuclear breakout or nuclear sneak out, because let's not forget that 60% enriched uranium itself is enough to make a bomb, but it'll be an unwieldy weapon, it'll be large, you'll have to ship it through a container. It's not going to be a valuable deterrent. The only reason nations enrich more and more and more is so that you can miniaturize it. In these 12 days, Iran showed that it has enough standoff warfare capabilities, because I'm sure all of us would have seen those videos of missiles hitting both Haifa, Tel Aviv, and multiple Israeli cities, right? So if Iran has a proven missile program, then it is in their interest and the interest of their deterrents to miniaturize and therefore to refine and enrich further. But that having been said, today, I feel that the question of Iran's view of nuclear weapons obfuscates the question of Iran's quest for conventional deterrence, right? In these 12 days, Iran proved itself conventionally. And there's another thing that is very, very evident in Iran today, which is the high degree of penetration by Israeli intelligence as well as American intelligence. There is very little that the Iranians can do which is not caught or observed by, say, the international community. And the Iranians have suffered this for a long time, right? The Iranians need a solid cover. They know that they need to rebuild conventionally, and they need to adapt to the region's changes, because they see the Arabs also react a little more adversely these days as to what exactly Israel is doing, right? But there is a clock. I feel there is a clock in terms of seeing what Iran is going to do, because let's not forget, we are now in August. By October, the JCPOA will officially expire, right, under the aegis of UNSC Resolution 2231, when European snapback sanctions will be triggered. Today, the Iranians are trying to lobby the European powers to not trigger those snapback sanctions, right? But if those sanctions are triggered, then it'll be interesting for me to see as to how that affects Iran's thinking. But so far, my inference has been, and this is in a world where those sanctions have not been implemented, that the Iranians in the long term are definitely convinced of the value of nuclear weapons, but in the short term, their priority will continue to be conventional deterrence. However, all of that might change if Israel attacks again. And Israel's strategic logic really changes day by day, and at this point, I think it's very difficult for anybody to reasonably assess what that logic is. Will Israel attack again? I'll wait for the next panel to answer that question. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Very well covered.
My question is for Stanley, sir. So, Iran threatened to block the Strait of Hormuz and even jammed GPS signals. Although the war has reached a ceasefire, Iran still holds a powerful card, that is control over Strait of Hormuz, so which is one of the important trade routes. So, how might this reshape the geopolitical balance? I have this question.
Morning. As Sir mentioned, someone like Trump is in the office and also Iran's shifted priorities. Do you think a deal like 2015 is possible in this context? And hypothetically, if how will that affect the West Asian dynamics?
2015?
2015?
Yeah, the nuclear deal that US and Iran did. If that is possible with Trump being in office and Iran shifted policies, and if hypothetically so, how will that change West Asian?
Sir, Stanley, sir, you clearly mentioned about how Trump withdrew from the treaty on 2018, and according to you, that was a failed conquest. But if you look at the long-term haul, as sir mentioned, October this is going to expire, and then Europe might again add sanctions to it. So, if we look at it from that point of view, after 2018, the Iranian economy has crippled. There is an anti-Shiite sentiment growing in Iran, and we have seen blackouts and inflation has increased, and there is a resentment against the regime as well. So on the long-term basis, if this goes on, so we might see a change in the regime as well. So what do you have to say about that? And one more point which I thought we did not cover. Just one point, sir. One more point I think which we did not cover is the cyber attacks that are taking place from both the sides. I would want your comments on that, because recently Israel also hacked two major national banks in Israel. Israel hacked two major national banks in Iran and their cryptocurrency-based Nobitex as well. So I would want your expert opinions on that as well. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
My question is from the Stanley, sir. Sir, yesterday you wrote on the X that we should shift from non-alignment to the multi-engagement. But
Say we should shift.
But you like this term more. You wrote this on the X.
I don't prefer multi-alignment, I prefer
Yeah,
multi-engagement.
Yes, multi-engagement. But sir, this multi-engagement leads us to the isolation. China is buying 44% of the oil from America, but America is treating us as we started war on Ukraine. So, and Pakistan foreign minister is also going to the Bangladesh on 26, maybe the next week. So it is bad diplomatically for us. So where our foreign policy went wrong, or is it timing?
Okay, yes. Though everybody's addressed it to Stanley, but I think you can share and quick points. I think some of the questions are overlapping.
So, cyber attack is beyond my area of expertise. Bashir, if you can shed light. Is this on? Hello? Hello. Yeah. So, Strait of Hormuz. Iran did not say that it would shut down Strait of Hormuz. Iran never make that threat publicly, okay? But it was conceived that because of, if you look at Iran's geographical presence, and Iran has the capabilities to shut down Strait of Hormuz, and that is Iran's nuclear option. And if Iran thinks that all the red lines are breached, if the Americans and the Israelis are attacking the Iranian state, and if the war continues, if they are left with no other option, they might do that. What I was talking about was that there were reports, and Reuters reported it first, saying that Iran had started mining Strait of Hormuz, and that's when Trump basically, swung back into action and, trying to bring the ceasefire into effect. So this was a possibility. But Iran's response, if you look at the war, was conventional response. Iran did not even Hezbollah did not, as General Brar pointed out, Hezbollah did not join the war actively. It was Iran, and Iran's response was, Israelis were attacking Iran. Iran's missile defense was weak, very weak, but Iran's offensive capabilities were relatively strong and powerful, right? And then they hit them back. This is what they were doing. But if the war continued, there was a possibility that Iran could, or Iran has the capability to shut down Strait of Hormuz. And that would be bad for global economy, that would be bad for India, that would be bad for China, that would be bad for the Gulf, that would be bad for the Americans. And if the Iranians did that, the Americans would be forced to start massive attacks on Iran's naval facilities from the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, right? Then it would lead to an open conflict. So if something like that happens, that is disastrous for all parties. But that didn't happen, mainly because this is disastrous for all parties, not only for the Iranians. The Americans also knew that economic consequences would be fatal, right? So if the war happens again, I think there is a fair chance the Israelis will bomb Iran again, because they haven't met their objectives, plain and simple. They haven't. So what they will do next? And the Iranians now have made it clear that, okay, they are ready to talk. They will talk, but they are not going to abandon their nuclear enrichment. That's the red line now, okay? So which means there is a fair possibility that the Israelis will go back and attack Iran. So, and the next level of attack would be, I think, even more catastrophic. So that we can wait and see. JCPOA, was the question whether JCPOA-like agreement would be possible under Trump? Was that the question? Okay, so Trump, I think he started negotiating with the Iranians, right? But with Trump, I really don't know. I'm still trying to make sense of his strategic thinking, all said and done. Because he seemed very open-minded about talking to the Iranians. He's open-minded about talking to everybody. He talked to the North Koreans. He met Putin this morning, right, in Alaska, in Anchorage. But whether this would lead to an agreement, I don't know, because as Bashir said, when the Israelis started bombing Iran, the Americans and the Iranians were technically in talks. On June 15th, the 6th round of talks were supposed to take place in Muscat. And on June 13th, the Israelis just went and attacked. And Israel is America's closest ally. And Trump, I don't know whether you were following his post. He said he wanted complete surrender from the Iranians. He didn't get it. But he posted that, right? Complete surrender. He said, I know where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. And it is, he was being magnanimous, so that Ayatollah Khamenei is not getting assassinated. This is the message he was sending. So I don't know, this is not the kind of messages that should be coming out of a leader who is committed to a diplomatic deal, right? So yes, he was open to talks, but I don't know whether he was serious about reaching an agreement. And now the Iranians, I can say, okay, there could be the possibility for an agreement, even now, okay? Iran has a lot of economic problems. There is no military solution to the nuclear program. So the best way forward is a diplomatic solution. But the Iranians are not going to abandon the nuclear enrichment. I can say that. It's not going to happen. Okay? They would like to maintain their enrichment. They might be ready to scuttle the nuclear program. They might agree to not to enrich uranium beyond 3.5%, no more 60%. All that is a possibility. But they are not going to abandon their nuclear enrichment program. They are not going to shut down their nuclear facilities, for sure. And the regime change and multi-engagement. So the Iranian regime was expected to fall from 1979 onwards. Yeah, it's been quite a lot of time, right? We don't know. I don't know okay, if you are asking whether there is discontent in Iran, of course there is. There are problems in the Iranian economy, serious problems. I was in Iran in 2022. If you want to go to a market, you will have to take, huge chunks of currency. It's hyperinflation. There are a lot of problems there. But you look how the Iranian society responded to the Israeli attack. If Prime Minister Netanyahu thought that the Israelis are going to liberate Iranians from the oppressive, evil, ruthless regime of Ayatollah, that's not how it happened, right? Even even the most hardened liberal and moderate critics of the Iranian state, they turned out to support the Iranian nation against the external aggression. If anything, the Israeli attack actually validated the conservative argument that the Israelis will come and bomb you at one point of time. And the Israelis did actually, come and bomb them. So I don't know whether I think we are a bit, it's slightly Western opinion that the Iranian regime has always been on the brink of collapse, but it doesn't collapse. So the problems we are facing in India's foreign policy, definitely we are facing a lot of challenges of late. I don't know whether it is a product of India's non-alignment, strategic autonomy, multi-alignment or multi-engagement, whatever you would like to call it. Whether the challenges we are facing is a product of this particular foreign policy doctrine, or is it a product of the way we exercise our foreign policy, right? I think we unnecessarily went out of our way to please Trump at the beginning. That wasn't actually necessary. And now when Trump turned against India, now we seem to be facing a lot of issues, right? I think it's rather, if you ask me, what would be the way forward? Imagine, I know a few years ago, 5 years ago, there were foreign policy experts who would argue that India has to align with the Americans because that's the way forward. Imagine if the Indians had done that. During the Ukraine war, we had moved away from the Russians completely, cut off ties with the Russians. What would have happened now? Because with Trump, this can happen anytime, right? Even if you are with the Americans or not, Trump can do this. So I think that was a cautious exercise. The strategic autonomy doctrine held India in good stead. There could be tactical setbacks, definitely, right? I mean, if you take a long view from 1947 onwards, this was my argument. From 1947 onwards, the foreign policy based in non-alignment, strategic autonomy is a different version of non-alignment. People might not like to talk about it because non-alignment, Nehru was the architect of non-alignment. Nowadays, they might not, people might not like to acknowledge it, but still, non-alignment, multi-alignment or multi-engagement or strategic autonomy, whatever you would like to call it, you will find a continuity, right? So the problem, one thing I agree with Air Marshal Matheswaran who said was non-alignment had an ethical source. The ethical source is being eroded. I mean, I'm a realist. I consider myself a realist. But even realism also has, morality plays an important role even in realism. You can't be deaf and blind to the atrocities that is happening in the world. There has to be some ethical foundation, right? So that is the question that we have to rebuild. So you rebuild that. So basically the multi-engagement foreign policy, I don't think that is a doctrinal issue. But the practice of foreign policy, we are facing challenges that we have to fix. Thank you.
I'll take 2 minutes also in the end, so maybe over to you. Points on...
In under 2 minutes from me as well. Just 2 points very quickly. I'll get to your cyber attack point, but first just to also add something on the question of the JCPOA-like agreement being possible today or not, right? If you remember the news updates coming from, well, very credible journalistic sources, and I'm sure all of you will improve that standard in the future, especially between the second and third round of talks between the Iranians and the United States, you were hearing a lot of options which sounded very similar to the original drafts of not just the JCPOA, but in all the iterations that it was known as in 2013 and 2014. And this included a potential consortium of Arab states with potential American involvement of supplying nuclear fuel for the Iranians to enrich, not on Iranian soil. And the Iranians, there was a speech that Arakchi was supposed to give, I think, at Carnegie, which was cancelled, but a draft of which was circulated amidst very credible sources of the Iranian media, which said that Iran was also open to the US nuclear industry partnering, just like how the Russians have partnered with the Iranians in Bushehr for another nuclear processing plant, so that the Americans also have a little more agency, and the Iranians are allowed to retain their sovereign right of enriching uranium on their own soil, right? And the other contours of the agreement were also seeming very similar to the JCPOA, and that, if anything, gave even more reasons for the Israelis, for whom the 2015 deal was anathema, and that was under a president who Netanyahu did not get along with. This is under a president who Netanyahu calls his best friend in the White House, right? So it became very clear that you almost were on the brink of getting a deal like that. I don't know what the brink could have seemed like, because, well, ultimately the Israeli attacks derailed everything, so everything is a counterfactual. But I think that's an interesting development to keep in mind should negotiations ever resume. But I suppose we'll see. On the question of cyber attacks, both states have capabilities. The Israeli capabilities are far better because it's proven, right? The Iranians, on the other side, have made several claims. They made claims even against Saudi Aramco in 2012. The Israelis, everybody remembers the Stuxnet attack, right? But more importantly, and linked to the JCPO question, is that even though the United States withdrew unilaterally in 2018, the Europeans and the Iranians at a very technical level still remained a little committed to the provisions of the JCPO, as well as the provisions of UNSC 2231. It's once you have a sabotage attack against the Natanz plant and reprocessing centers, I think in late 2021, that the Iranians really go back on several of their obligations and commitments. So what we have here is evidence of the cyberspace directly influencing other instruments of policy that Iran as well as the United States might apply. But I will add one caveat here, is that for a state like Iran, for whom deterrence is also set by symbolism and spectacle, as we saw in April when Iranian cruise missiles and drones were being live streamed by all the countries along the way, and everybody knew the Iranian missiles are coming. Similar to the Al Udeid attack, the Americans, I mean, Trump is not known for his subtlety. He even announced that it's done, they needed to get it out, it's done, right? So, well, yeah, the Iranians need to get it out. Cyber attacks don't work that way. Cyber attacks are neat, precise, quiet, silent, meant to be effective, right? Not for publicly claimed deterrence. That is why for the longest time, even the Israelis never claimed these attacks, right? Because for them, the objective is to actually also set back a lot of Iranian nuclear capabilities and conventional capabilities apart from the public spectacle. And the Israelis don't claim most of their attacks. That's only a recent phenomenon, if anything else. So I think that's important to keep in mind if you think of cyber capabilities, that even if Iran substantially improves its capabilities, these fundamentals of how Iran behaves with states in its region as well as the United States, those will remain.
Okay, thank you. I'll just take 2 minutes just to summarize maybe some of the points which have already been covered or the questions asked. The Entente was not covered. You see, Russia, China and North Korea, what was their reaction to this? Except for saying that the attacks are not good, they didn't interfere. The reason is, as far even Russia and China are concerned, they are not interested, because you see, look at their core interest, they're not interested in Iran getting a nuclear weapon. The only interest of Russia mainly is that there should be no regime change so that the Iran doesn't come under the influence of the West. So that is the Russian angle to it. So everybody plays to his angle. So they remained muted. They didn't want, so when the attack was happening on the nuclear facility, it suited Russia and China. But they didn't want the regime change, so that was a kind of an off-ramp from as far as that is concerned. Strait of Hormuz, you see 25% of oil and natural gas and much more trade passes through that. So even if, though Iran is not a very strong militarily country, it is okay. But even if it is able to stop, the others will not allow it. Mainly China, even India is affected, Russia, so it won't be allowed. So he can always use it as a threat. The next point was on cyber attack. You see, cyber attack is now a very big field, and I don't know how it is understood by this thing. Now there's something called the multi-domain warfare. So cyber attacks are not on your financial institute. The cyber attacks are on, because all your systems are technical now. All your missile systems, all your space, all your communication, all your ISR, your quantum communication, everything. So you have to attack your jamming. You must have heard of something called kill chain and all, which happened in Op Sindoor. So there is a net centricity of warfare which is happening. So it's a huge domain. So it is the warfare which is going to be attacked by cyber in all forms, and it's a big topic. So Israel is good, and of course Iran did retaliate, but that is just hacking some sites. That hacking site is not cyber attack. It doesn't make any difference. You see, if you are able to neutralize the missile defense itself, that is cyber attack. Regime change, as I mentioned, of course, that is there. For USA, regime change also, it's my view, may not be in their interest. The interest of US, Israel was to make sure that nuclear weapons are subdued, and that they achieved. Because they also need a counterweight to Saudi Arabia and the people there. Please understand, the big powers always make counterweights. So if Iran is countervailing Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, it suits them. So everything remains in balance as far as the great game is concerned. As far as talking on nuclear deal is concerned, Obama administration started the talks. Then, of course, Trump came in. He said he wanted to show Obama down. He said this is a bad deal. And Biden started it and restarted it, went off. But now I think because of the situation, they may be into talks. And of course, they may bide time as, if they really want to go in for that nuclear thing. As far as our own foreign policy is concerned, of course, I'm not saying who was good or bad. But whenever a country is rising, you will have a lot of headwinds. So we are in that phase. Nobody will praise you. Nobody will give you any credit. It is from all sides. I can see that. And as far as peace in Middle East is concerned, we have met Israeli officers. One has the opportunity to deal with everybody. There are many people who want peace. And peace can only come if there's non-violence. There have been many occasions when they were about to sign deals, two-state, everything was happening, but then there was attack from whether Hezbollah or somebody else attacked. So that happens in India, Pakistan also. There are many people within, and these people are the same ones who want to retain power. The power centers and the moneyed people of all this resistance front is in Qatar. They are spending a lavish life. So they dictate you, and the sufferers are the poor people. So, wherever, even it is not US or this thing, that the power centers on the other side, every side are the ones who dictate. Whether it's a so-called terrorist front, depending on whose side you are. So I think, I just thought I'll just say these few points. But thank you once again for inviting me, and I think it was a wonderful session. I enjoyed it, and thank you to the distinguished audience and to the front two rows. Thank you. And I think they deserve a round of applause.
Is this working? We will just take a 15-minute break, so please be back here by 11:43. Okay.